Welcome, everyone. This is covering Chapter 13 of the DataMesh book. The chapter's pretty meaty, so I'm going to jump right into it. And Elliot has to go in the middle, so don't feel bad, like I did a bad thing. He told me already, and Varsha's going to jump in. And so also if I'm, oh, hi, Varsha, we're just getting started.
Hey, everyone.
Yeah, nice to see everybody. We're recording. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to get started. At the end of my presentation, Matt so graciously is going to show us a little bit about Azure Fabric, just a really informal 10-minute or so demonstration. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. And again, when I am sharing, I cannot see you guys, and so you have to speak up. Okay. I'll try to have pauses. Chapters 13 and 14, kind of this whole section of this entire book, part 4 to me is the most applicable, a pragmatic part. I mean, you have to read all the other stuff to kind of understand the concepts. But, you know, as I mentioned previously, I'm trying to build some prototypes for my genomics customers. And this is really the meaty parts of it. And again, remember, this book is like a year or so old. And so, you know, the products are evolving, the cloud products. And so it's interesting to see what is available. So this chapter is, you know, very, very important in our world of data products. So it's design, discovering, understanding, and composing data. And I found it to be very thought-provoking. I wish I had more answers, but it makes me ask a lot of questions, especially since I actually tried to start designing a little baby mesh, if you will. So the idea here is that in our world of data product microservices, that we're going to have characteristics of discoverability, understandability, trustworthiness, and explorability of our data. So to me, one of the most important ones for my customers is discoverability, as there become more and more data repositories of genomic data and cancer image data as reference data sets. So that might be different in your particular case, but I often talk with my researchers, and they spend a lot of time, you know, just combing the internet and talking to their colleagues at conferences about where they can get data sets. So again, as is usual, I think for my domain, I'm probably a little bit unique compared to some of you guys, because it's just so fast moving and so much data, and it's public-private, you know, it's not just in the organization. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting about discoverability, and I think, again, you know, you can tell the authors kind of worked on a lot of enterprise, kind of probably financial clients, because I think, you know, she says, at the time of this writing, I would really, like, for my clients, it's like, at the time of this writing, there are 2 possible approaches. I wouldn't really call the second one established in bioinformatics. It's like aspirational. So the first approach is like what we're used to, in terms of data quality, you have data stewards, governance team, you have identification, metadata, tagging, documentation, consolidation, domain-specific experts. Like, that's been out there for a long, long, long time. The second approach, I think, is really emerging, especially with the abilities of Gen AI, and that's her fancy words, a posteriori investigative intelligence. Basically, it's machine learning. So it's machine learning to extract metadata. I am seeing this around cancer image cell identification, because one of the problems that has come up with some of the research teams that I work with is human annotators' time is just so expensive. And as more and more and more data sets become available, it's interesting how one lab actually solved this. They kind of did a blended approach. They did a crowdsource thing with grad students from a consortia of many universities. And then they made a machine learning model to evaluate the quality of what the grad students manually annotated, because actual annotators' time was just too expensive to get high quality data sets. So it was like a blended approach. And I just thought that was really interesting. It's a library that I'm actually working with the team. So maybe I'll just pause here and ask if anybody else has got any experience with machine learning for data curation in your domains.
Yeah, so in a few ways, like I think I've talked about some of the stuff that we've done with OpenAI, like for enrichment and like labeling and stuff like that, which I think is really great. Expensive, but like extremely powerful. I also want to note that just like you're seeing it in a lot of the products, like so like with generative AI, like one of the thing that just seems obvious to me is everything's going to be a co-piloted. Every product feature is co-piloted, and you're seeing it in like catalogs. Like if you look at like Databricks, and like they just released their catalog, it's just going to make up the metadata without you, and you go in and confirm it, right? So yeah, I think that this is very much real and very much happening, right? In a bunch of different ways, even in the enterprise, like in tool sets such as these. And that's going to be table stakes. Like I don't think there's going to be a data catalog that doesn't do, like that won't exist as a concept unless it does this going forward, right?
I think so too. What I saw on LinkedIn that GitHub Copilot was one of the most adopted technology service releases in X period of time. I mean, to me, it's a search evolved, right? Like and I've said this before, once you work with these new copilots, you don't want to go back to Googling because it seems kind of backward. Do you know? That's what I think anyway. So like you said, table stakes. Okay, so DataMesh designs for discoverability for machine and human access. That's important. And she doesn't specifically say it, but this is a pattern out of operational microservices for a long time. It's called ports and adapters. And that's basically what this is. And I think probably everybody on the call knows about this, but maybe people watching don't know. The idea is that you have these methods to interact with the data products. And you can see, and she's said this in other chapters, for discovery, you have these sort of common paradigms, search, browse, and then user content, which would be like ratings, stars, stuff like that. And then data product discovery has its own vernacular. So again, like my domain, you're going to have like medical coding for patient records, right? That's going to now be LLM weighted so that you can ask that question in English rather than having it as a search parameter. Again, the machine learning part of this is and machine learning particularly with LLMs is the kind of new stuff coming, I think. Self-registration and global URIs. What I think about with this, and again, I'm going to give all my domain specific stuff because that's what I have, right? Is that cloud buckets are globally unique. And so that already kind of solves that, because if you place your data in buckets, then you have your globally unique identifier for the bucket all the way down to the individual item. Now, if you use other sort of data storage, then you might have to put a layer over the top of it. And again, my world is 98% buckets. And I realize that is not the entire data world, but that is my world. And so I kind of shortcut this problem. So again, I'll pause and see if anybody else has been having any situation with global URIs. I know of ways in the old database world, but I haven't done it for like 10 years.
Yeah, like the global URI, which like the thing I think about with buckets is like, there's also this tension with the obfuscation of infrastructure. Like you don't know what's behind it, but like if you point into a bucket, they know it. That's very concrete, right? Especially since one of the best practices is putting your account number and region in the bucket name, right? So, yeah, I think it's a good metaphor. I think conceptually it makes a lot of sense. In terms of having like this permanent global pointer to a specific data product. I think beyond the bucket, it just requires like some thought in terms of what that actually would be. You know what I mean?
Yep. That's interesting that you say that, because I literally just had that with a client where it held up some data processing because the team didn't think of that, and they put some identification that the security team had an issue with in the bucket name.
Yeah.
And they had to get a security exception. It's different clouds, make it easier. Amazon has that nice aliasing feature.
Yeah.
That is so handy, where you can just alias the account name. Does Azure have that? I would assume they do. So you can hide the account URL. Does anybody know?
You know what? I'm not quite sure. That's a good question, but I haven't come across that yet.
Yeah. Amazon just makes it very, very easy to do it. So props to them. So then they start talking about semantic and syntax models, like how are you storing your data? Bucket obviously is a blob, but you could be storing tables, you could be storing JSON, you could be storing graphs. And of course, the hot thing right now is embeddings, right? So this whole idea of embeddings, which is, if you take text as an input, for example, you're basically encoding the words and the word similarities, and then you're putting that as numbers in a vector database, and they're simply multidimensional vectors, and then you're using that to augment your queries to LLMs. And this is the hot space right now, and you can tell it's hot because it wasn't in her book a year ago. That's how new it is. But it's interesting to see the velocity of this. I really honestly don't think that I have had it's sort of like a hurricane, like changing search. First, ChatGPT came out, and that was about 2 months for everybody to understand it and use it, and then Copilot. And now it seems like in my world, just every day, people are talking about retrieval augmented generation, which is the acronym for using this type of storage, RAG. Augmentation. Is this, again, just me? Am I chasing the shiny new thing, or are you guys hearing as much about embeddings and vector DBs?
Yeah, I definitely am. Even just for semantic search problem areas, right?
Yep.
I think it's incredibly useful, and it's also like very tangible outside of the, kind of LLM use cases that people think about. It just seems it lower barrier entry for sure, right? You've got some text. You want to extract the meeting and be able to search on it, like
yep.
It's all technology people understand and can kind of house within their cloud or data center, right? So yeah, a lot of talk about vectors and embeddings and vector DBs.
So
yeah,
go ahead.
I'd only heard about that for the first time at the DevOps Enterprise Summit they just had a few weeks ago, and they did a whole session on it. I've seen ChatGPT and all this stuff, and they talk about these LLMs, but they're bringing in vector databases. They're talking about a lot of open source models that people have created where you can download these, run them on your own hardware, and do kind of your own models. And people were tweaking these and just giving them out for free.
Yep.
And the idea that you needed some hardware, but I mean, people were talking like, oh, I've got, 5 machines under my desk, and I'm running these large models for a company data, using open source models that people far smarter than me have done, and it's based off of some of this stuff in their vector data. I was just blown away. I didn't realize there was that part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, one of the things is I always want to get my hands on things, and so I'm just some stuff that I've been working on. So a colleague of mine, he is working on this professionally, and I just encouraged him to publish a little bit, and so he did. And so this is Brick Ellis, and it's out on GitHub. So it's persisting a ChromaDB vector database with LangChain and querying it with ChatGPT as simply as possible. And he just has a couple of notebooks. And then another thing that he did that was really interesting to me, he speaks Russian. And to your point about you can just augment, what he wanted to do is he wanted to just not even use an LLM, just use basically embeddings. And he wanted to read a book side by side in his Kindle with Russian and English. And so he wrote this implementation. This is just generating embeddings and putting it in a vector database. And the other example is the full thing, which is embeddings a vector database and then tying it to a public LLM to augment the queries. Yeah, cool stuff, right? And then another example of this is on Colabs, and this one is maybe more like relatable for the greater population. This is using a Google Cloud process called Vertex AI Vector Search, which is basically accessing their vector database and embeddings for text on Stack Overflow. And it's an end-to-end example. It takes about 15, 20 minutes to run, but you can run it for free without a Google account. And it kind of gives you like the full end-to-end process. Because it took me a while. I mean, I'll just tell you honestly, I didn't understand it in the beginning. I thought you had to retrain the model because that's what I was sort of used to. And although that's theoretically possible because these models have so many parameters to them, it's sort of like not practical. So you just augment with this additional information stored in this new format. Not to get, too out in the weeds, but because it just is such a hot topic and she's talking about different ways that you can store. That's like yet another one. We have relational tables, we have JSON, we have blobs, and now we have embeddings in a vector DB because we don't have enough things to worry about, right? So we'll have jobs until we retire. So the next thing she talks about is, and I thought this was really interesting, data guarantees. Again, this just shows she works for enterprises because very professional. I'm not used to data guarantees around analytics data. I know that that's out there, but in my, 15 years as a consultant, it's been very rare that there's been SLOs on the operational side, like how long till the customer website comes up, right? But in terms of on the analytics side, I haven't really worked with this. I've heard of it in finance because, time's money there on their reporting. So this was really interesting to me. So data quality metrics, data maturity metrics. I guess I see life cycle because of the size of the data. And I also see diversity in health data, like lack of diversity in some of these genomic data sets, so profiling. And that is actually reported as the quality of the data set. So I have seen that. Degree of usage would be, stars or user count, right? An example of that would be like Kaggle data sets. And then this is definitely my world. This is medical record standard, health something, FHIR it's called. So the FHIR format is medical records in many hospitals. Most hospitals in the US have to comply to this so that the data can interoperate. And so that's just good old schema validation. It's like JSON data. And then temporality metrics. So when things were processed, again, I think this is not so much my health research domain. It might be more like finance. I don't know. What do you guys have to say about these quality metrics? I guess they're going to be different, or data guarantees. They're going to be different in different domains. Like in education, at your school, what kind of quality metrics do you have to deal with?
Yeah, well, it's crazy because the state of California has a what they call a student longitudinal database that is meant to curate data over years, right? And it used to just be while students are in school, and it was to make sure they're being provided a high quality and equitable education. Now it's also, well, how are they getting into schools? What are we talking about? Pre-K, preschool? How are they, where are they going when they leave? Is it career, military, higher ed? And then when they come up with programs now that are usually driven by legislature. So let's talk about like during COVID, how do you make sure people who are on various meal programs are still getting their info, their data? Sorry, funding. It was all based off this data. And so it became really crucial because typically school districts, we would upload our data a few times a year and they check it each time. And the rules are always changing and it's getting more complex. From a data perspective, it's really interesting, but you can say, hey, I've got a student that came to us October 1st and then they left in March 3rd. Let's say the parents moved. Well, another district says, no, I have that exact same student who came to us on March 1st. And the state of California is like, well, they can't be in two good school districts at the same time, right? And so you've got to figure all that out. And a lot of that data quality isn't found until it reaches the state level, because the student data may look perfectly fine on our end. We certainly have a lot of quality metrics of our own. You know, Izzy and courses, you say that they're in such and such program, but they didn't actually take a class taught by a credentialed teacher in that program, right? They're getting really detailed, which you know, on one hand, from a data point of view, it's great if my student is in an AP calculus test or in class that's qualifying for college credit. Let's make sure they have a certified calculus teacher in that class, right? And with teacher shortages, sometimes that's hard to do. And so again, this data helps the state make sure that there's teachers and things like that available. But it's really interesting. And a lot of the quality metrics, it's hard to run internally. We do run quite a bit ourselves. But again, it's on ad hoc SQL databases, reporting that we've done our own. The state's trying to catch up with this. It's still a very, I'll just be polite. It's a system that is requiring a lot of love and a lot of work. So we're getting there, but so quality, yeah, it's amazing.
Maybe it goes to the next section of this, which is composition, right? The data needs to be composable so the state can then validate it. So,
and there is no unified state databases. There is one. There are other states that are much smaller have this. The state literally has their own student information system. But in California, there's easily at least 5 or 6 primary players, and then at least a dozen or 2 of small players. So it's an incredibly hard problem. But I really appreciate discussions like this, because when it comes down to the funding wire and all our data looks fine, and suddenly some district up north says, no, you've got the same kid we have. Now it's who's right? And it comes down to your data quality. So anytime we can head those off at the pass earlier, the better it is.
interesting. So, okay, so then going through then the shape of data, which again is like, is it a table? Is it JSON? Is it a blob? I'll learn with documentation. I just called out, they talk about computational notebooks. This is very much my world. It's almost becoming standard when people publish health research. They will now publish not only their analysis code on GitHub, their anonymized underlying data, but they will often publish Jupyter notebooks because of their ability to include, markdown code, and most importantly, visualizations, which are, super important in the world of research where you have so much data. So this becomes more and more the case. An interesting thing, again, Lynn on the Gen AI bandwagon, is you can actually generate documentation from Gen AI as metadata, which some people are doing, which is interesting. So, yeah. Okay, then finally the sidecar that we talked about so much, that you can, use a sidecar for quality, basically. Again, I think that's a nicely said, but I haven't seen too many examples. So in here, they're showing the ports and adapters where you've got like the high level plane. Here's our data product, where we have the basically expressed as APIs, the discoverability, quality, and the output port, which this I think would be for people, and this would be for machines. That's the way I read it, to make the data product understandable, basically. Composition, this again is ports and adapters. Once you have these, ways of interacting with the data, then to compose the data products, you access them. And this is an example from the example in the book with playlists and social media and how you would, using JSON format, basically, associate. And again, it's nice to see an example, but in the real world, of course, this is going to be hideously more complex because that's just the way the real world is. And then it goes on to talk about the consumption of data design patterns, ability to discover, ability to link, ability to relate over time, kind of things that she's already said. And then the traditional approaches, I just kind of laughed when I saw this because this is so old. Gosh, my book was published in 2008, and this is what I wrote about in 2008. So this is good old OLAP data warehousing. So where you have a fact table, and I think everybody on this call is probably experienced enough to know this, where you ETL your relational data and you combine your linking values into a humongous fact table, and then you have associated dimension tables called a star schema. This is a very old technology. So conceptually it looks like that. And the dimension tables are really, really tiny, and the fact tables really, really huge. And then you use some sort of OLAP storage, which is optimized for this design. I don't see too many people using this anywhere because it involves the transformation of data, and it's very rigid in terms of structure. And notice she says that DataMesh moves away from explicitly defining facts or joining tables because it's too rigid. There's too much overhead. It's just not flexible enough. It's kind of a obsoleted technology. That being said, though, I know there's a bazillion data warehouses out there because it was the prevalent technology for years and years and years.
Well, and that's interesting because Fabric, and I'll talk about it when I show later, they do have a whole data warehousing component, which is all about this. But half the work you don't even do in data warehouse. You don't need to. And I was wondering where this fits into the current modern structure. So that's interesting.
Yeah. So Varsha, I know that you have done a lot of work in this traditional data warehousing, and if I follow your social media correctly, you just got a new job in the finance area, so congratulations, and that's where you had a lot of experience. So I'm curious, are you still seeing a lot of data warehouses, like this classic star schema in the finance vertical?
It is, and they are still struggling the way we are trying to understand data mesh right now, because we know drastically, gathering the data, and both the worlds are pretty much same. Like, inflow is like anything, and then protection, and then saving it secure, and then retiring, and everything is just together. So, these days, what I see the people, team members, they are trying to create the nice zones for it. So they are trying for the multiple clouds, and same way multiple marts, and then they are trying to club it up. So it is happening in actually, I would say, brainstorming. It is, because as we all know how every zone itself has got its challenges, every cloud has its challenges. So now, since we all know multi-cloud culture is there just to make things more consistent and not relying on anyone. And for sure, everything is split up. Everywhere people are trying to fix in as many rules, profiles possible, making it more secure. It is happening, but it's still a struggle. Struggle is typically where we are, long back we were talking about the interoperability. That is still a challenge, because the moment we open that port up and we are opening it to world. So now I see architects sitting in the calls and where we get involved and then talk about it. So their concern is we are fine within the zone. You can design whatever way you want, whatever profile, security, whatever way you want to do that. Infrastructure wise, we can, but the point is, the moment other zone comes in and you want them to interact, and then you want to serve as one platform, that's something real challenging. Had it been just one certain cloud, they have whole lot of governance involved. But when you talk about other chunks too, so other governance, people, compatibility, compliance, many things come into the picture, and then it's like opening the holes.
Indeed. Indeed. Yeah, I do. I do actually have a project that's very real. It's working. It's got 7 research organizations, different clouds, just like you said, Varsha, all kinds of different stuff. And we are in it right now. So one of the things that she talks about here, just one sec, is to use a distributed type system. And the idea here is to use graphs. And to me, this is quite cutting edge. Now, I have some startups that I advise that are doing this. And this, of course, is the social media approach because it's very schema light. But for enterprise to move to this is, like you're saying, Varsha, I don't see the path to go from something so structured, like an OLAP data warehouse, to just some graph links. You know what I mean? There needs to be something in the middle.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is. And I'm actually trying to build it myself.
You know what? Because till time everything was so much organized, structured, and now we are trying to club it up and trying to build a good big platform. And obviously, Junction is gonna make a mess. That's what we know. Until we know it can be defined. We know the moment we create the nice profile, again, the governance and compliance. So everything comes into the picture and then we are blown up. We are still going back to the old school and okay, sections and then done. So usually it is happening, but I'm sure the way things are moving, it is gonna help us everywhere. I'm just seeing that.
Well,
Yeah.
there has been these efforts around what's called the semantic web. And although there's so much hype around it, it never really took hold because it was too unstructured. And so what's interesting is, what is it going to be? And you know, we who are in the front of this are going to have to figure out some hybrid approach between the rigidity of the OLAP cube and the Wild West of the just have a bunch of links and graphs. And I think to your point, Varsha, it really does come down to security, because if you have to have more flexibility, then security has to be more tightly defined. So here she's talking about you can use distributed type systems, you can use global URIs, which again is great if you have buckets, but if you don't, then you have to build a whole layer around it. Data entity URIs. And then this is interesting, the machine optimization. Is there some sort of machine learning augmentation you can put to create these links or something? And then the human element. So this is an area where, like I said, when I started the discussion today, I give her credit for bringing this up. It's a very important topic. In this section, this composition of data really caused me to have more questions than answers. And I think really the way forward is there's going to be a lot of custom solutions, because some places like where I have health data, the security is going to be paramount. Where there's other cases where maybe it's aggregation of social media information and it's more of a speed optimization, it's going to be hand created. Because there isn't a clear pattern yet, in my opinion. And that is where this chapter ends. The last chapter is on managing, governing, and observing. And again, it's a very meaty chapter. So we're going to have our meeting in, I think it's November 16th. That'll be our last meeting, because the last section of the book is about soft skills. And I don't find value really in discussing that. So we'll have one more meeting where we discuss this. And I really think in this book, for me, the meatiest chapter is this whole section right here. What I want to do now is I'm just going to turn it over to Matt, because he so kindly is going to show us a little bit about Microsoft Fabric, and just really informal. He's just getting started, so it's kind of like learning in public. So I really, really appreciate it.
So, and you should be able to see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so whenever I'm learning something, I start writing lots of notes and questions, and this document is, 21 pages long. We're not going to do that. But anyway, this is one of the first things that I saw, and definitely jump in if you have questions. We're just going to show you this, and then I'm going to jump into Fabric itself. But Microsoft has all these tools. They've had them for a long time. They've refined a lot of things, and now they've stuck it under their ecosystem for Microsoft Fabric and rebranded it. And one of the biggest things is they have their One Lake underneath this. And so if you've used SharePoint or OneDrive, it's kind of their idea of this is where all your data sits. And it's just one unified foundation. So even if you have different departments, different domains, different workspaces, whatever, it underlying is all in the same lake. And it's got a lot of interesting aspects to that. So they have their tools on top of it. But the lake, you can put your data into it. It's various kinds of data. It could be image files. It could be text files. It could be whatever you want. Your data, your files, your Spark tables and things like that are in here too. But it also has connectors. So if your data is sitting in blob storage on some other platform, you don't actually need to suck it in to use it. You can actually just create a shortcut to it. And they're kind of, I know, offering that as a really nice feature. You don't have to pay yet again to duplicate your storage if you don't need to. And of course, that all depends on latency and ingest and other costs. But if that makes sense, it works. The other interesting thing is their One Lake has a Windows Explorer connector. So if you are a Windows shop, you can literally put a file or some flat files in here and say, give them to your finance team. So maybe they have a list of vendors they normally work with. They like to work in Excel or whatever. They can literally open up the file in Windows. It looks like it's an actual Excel file. They can type into it, do whatever they want, hit save, and without realizing it, they're actually manipulating data real time that is sitting in Fabric. And between creating various workspaces and permissions, of course, and things like this, you could actually give access to any of those files to different departments and different people. And if they're very Windows-centric, it kind of feels like what they're used to using anyway. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. I personally don't like manipulating flat files on my own that are sitting somewhere up in the cloud that are being worked on with pipelines and stuff. But I did think that was fairly interesting because we have a lot of business people who love Excel. They're really good in Windows. And when you start talking about blob storage and buckets, their eyes kind of glaze over. And that's really not their area. So I found that kind of interesting. And so they've got their various tools on top. I'll just go through them real quick, but Data Factory is kind of part of their ingesting data manipulation, ETL. Their Synapse data engineering and data science is, of course, your transformations. You can do statistics and build models and things like that. That all happens here. Their data warehouse is your classic data warehouse, Lynn, that we talked about. You can build your OLAPs and everything else. Real-time analytics, this is KQL and some other things. You can ingest data real time if you've got IoT and other stuff and do analysis and things on it. Power BI is, of course, their reporting. Data Activator is interesting. I've played with it. It's still very much in preview. But this is where if anything happens real time on one of these other inputs, you can actually trigger things. So it's like a way to get into their workflow. And you can trigger different pipelines of the things. I think you can even trigger different functions and other workflows in Azure. But so if you're doing real-time analytics and you say, if it gets above a certain threshold, you build that in Data Activator and it kicks off some other item. It's still in preview, so it doesn't work with a whole lot. It's interesting. It works with Power BI. That's a little foreign to me. But basically, if you were to build a report that shows certain KPIs or metrics and you say, oh, if my whatever, if this factor dips less than 20% of its norm, even though that's in a report, Data Activator can watch that. So if you were to create a dashboard, say for some of your analytics folks or metrics on your behavior of your business, your Activator can actually watch the report. You're not building this in two different places. So that kind of makes sense on a very high level, and I'll jump into the product itself.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So when you come in, and don't get overwhelmed, this is the home section, and depending on what you have available, you're going to see a lot of different buttons, but they do have recommendations. They have all of your data down here. They're kind of trying to work on discoverability. But initially, I can create brand new items over here. I can browse what I already have. When you're browsing, they show all of your stuff. But when you search and do the filters and stuff, you're actually searching across everything that you have access to you in your entire fabric. So you can see I've got notebooks in here, I've got lake houses, I got different workspaces, I have reports, I have data sets. And again, it's part of that discoverability where I can say, this is the data I'm looking for, and here are all the different places that have been published that you have access to that you can go see it. They are adding new things all the time. So they have other things like endorsements. Like you can, as a data scientist, you can say this data is high quality and I can endorse it and promote it. And so you may have different samples of different types of data, and you can say, oh, well, this is the one that's the de facto standard for, you know, personnel or payroll or something. Sensitivity, of course, whether you can share it outside, share it with other people, and then where it's currently residing. But they're always updating this, which is really interesting. The endorsement is something I think that's only been available in the last couple of months. But this is kind of how they're approaching their discoverability a little bit. One like Data Hub. But anyway, the meat of it, I've got a lot of things open, is they have everything's controlled by workspaces. So if you go into workspace, I've already created some stuff, but I just want to show you how easy this is. If I say I want to create a new workspace, a workspace is a collection of everything you're working on. So the workspace, I kind of feel like, is like the products. So the workspace is where you're going to create your lake houses. You can have multiples of them, all your notebooks, your data transformation. Everything lives within the single workspace. And so you give it a name. There are domains, and so domains are logical. Every workspace can only belong to one domain. Right now, it's more informational. They are talking about assigning certain permissions at the domain level. So when we talk about governance and other type of stuff, they're talking about adding that. I haven't quite seen that come out yet, so this is more logical, but it is exciting to see what they may do with it. And if anyone wants to play around with this, as you're creating your workspace, this is where they have their licenses, and they do have different capacities. So right now I'm on the trial, which is really fun. You know, you get 60 days to play with it. I would definitely suggest trying it out. Fabric capacity is what we're talking about, and they have all different sizes for your capacity. I believe the smallest capacity runs about $350 a month. We have played with that. It has more performance than the training. The training is good for training and playing. I have noticed it get a little slow. The fabric capacity, the smallest one for $350 a month. I mean, I guess that's around $10 a day. Really, it's been adequate for the small stuff we played with and pretty responsive. So I was kind of happy with that. But that's how you create one. It literally takes like 5 seconds to create, which is really neat. Once you get your workspace created, and I am in my MP fabric testing workspace, you get this type of screen. And they have different, I don't know if you call them environments or what, but they're, again, trying to organize this depending on what your role is. And so if I'm in a data engineering role, I can click on this. I'm inside my workspace, and it's like, oh, hey, do you want to create a lake house, a notebook, a data pipeline, do you want to import a notebook, things like that. They recommend things for you, of course. Even though I'm kind of trapped in here, I can still select my new and create anything I want. But their data engineering is around the lake houses, the notebooks, your Spark jobs. Your data science is where you can create your models. I would love to have one set up, and maybe next time we meet, if you're interested, I can set up a couple of. But what I found interesting to them, and Lynn, you're probably really familiar with this. I haven't seen it quite done this way. But they have experiments. And so you create a model or several models. You run several experiments, and each experiment tracks the little tweaks you make and the successes and failures and basically the quality of the model. And so you can run several experiments, and it's tracking every single one of these for you. And so right here, you can say, oh, well, this tweak had this improvement, this didn't. And then by the end, you can, I believe, publish the experiments and the models that work for you. Which is kind of neat. I thought that was cool. If you're in data warehouse, this is where you would create your warehouse itself. Again, this is kind of a logical container, and this is where you build your fact tables and everything else. Real-time analytics, this is where you get into things like creating a KQL database, querying event streams. So this is off of Azure. If you have a lot of devices or logs or anything that's publishing to those event streams, you can make use of them here. Power BI is their reporting. And so that's what this looks like. We've got all our data sets here. I can create new reports and everything from here. So again, they try to organize this based on user. But remember, every single thing you're seeing here is living in the same, that one lake. So there's really no ingestion costs or anything like that as long as it's in there. Data Factory, as we mentioned, is where you do most of your ingestion, your ETL. So that's an overview of how you get around some kind of neat things. I found I've worked kind of the most in the data engineering side. Like anything Microsoft, there's 10 ways to do the same thing. It really depends on what you're comfortable with, what makes sense for you. Because a lot of this stuff, you'll see like pipeline shows up in 3 or 4 these different workspaces. There's always a place to get your data manipulated some way. Notebooks show up a lot too. Once I'm in the data engineering side now is again where you would start to do stuff. So I would create a data lake house. I would load data into there. And so I created a data lake house. Again, it takes like 5 seconds to do this stuff, which is really neat. There's really no cost to trying and playing. So now when you're in the data lake house, you've got your tables and your files. You'll notice a nice little statement up here. SQL endpoint for querying has been created for you automatically. So right there, it's indicating, hey, throw some data in here, hit it with SQL, have fun, which was neat. So files, you can literally upload files. You can upload folders. These can be CSVs, images, whatever you want. In my files, I've got a sales CSV. If I want to turn it into an actual table so I can get schemas, of course, you can do that with notebooks, everything else. You can just literally click on, say, load a new table. It figures out the schema for you. You can make some adjustments. And then here, I've got this right here. What's really neat now is I can literally say, hey, open this in a notebook. And so right there, it automatically creates a notebook for you. Here, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I mean, this is a full-on notebook. And what's really neat is the notebook itself. You can run various languages that you're familiar with. This is the default language for the entire notebook. But you've got your markdown area. So it does do Python. I remember, PySpark, Scala, SQL. That's their Spark version of SQL R if you're interested in that. You just add your code things. So you can do markdown. Forget how to show the markdown. But you add your code, and then you run it, and you're good to go. What's really neat is within the code cells, you can say, well, I want PySpark for most stuff, but I want to run SQL or R for this particular bucket, this particular code section, which is really neat. I ran it. This particular one, you'll see it says took 25 seconds. It's all within the session. On the training instance that I'm running yet, this was kind of long. Usually I've seen sessions start up in about 15 to 18 seconds, and then it runs really fast after this. All this is doing is grabbing data from that sales table. I load it and it's displaying in a frame. If I were to run it again, let's see, it shouldn't take yeah, there we go, 3 seconds. And I mean, this was obviously very simple. But once the session's running and you keep it running, it's actually pretty responsive. When I did the very lowest tier of the paid instance, it probably took about 8-10 seconds for the session to start up. So now that I'm in here, I can do all normal things. This is in our notebook, so we can have all kinds of, again, if you're doing statistics or PySpark or some other stuff, do a lot of interesting things. One thing I liked is when you have the results, it shows you a normal table, but I can throw this in a chart. I can just play around with it inside my notebook here. If I'm going too fast, just let me know. I know we're coming up on time. But hey, I want a bar chart. I'll do a column chart, no big deal. Sales order doesn't make any sense. How about we do based off of the item, and that's my key, and my quantity, my value is probably, let's see how much we're selling. For that, I'm going to go ahead and say apply. And so right here, the notebook, I'm able to manipulate. This isn't very exciting data. I've done some of their other training things, which were far more impressive, but that was kind of neat. I didn't have to write any code. I'm not messing around up here and forgetting a comma or the wrong command or something. But of course, I can save it as images. I can do things really quick. But when it's a table, I can also explore it in other ways, my CSV and JSON, if I want to export it somewhere else. But this is all within the notebook. So you can create all kinds of notebooks. You can share them with other people. You'll notice there's an open in VS Code extension here. I did play with this a bit. I love VS Code. I found, at least when I played with it 2 weeks ago, it wasn't bad. I love VS Code for manipulating notebooks in the interface and the UI they have. But it seemed like the syncing wasn't quite great. I would make changes in my notebook in VS Code, and I would hit publish several times, save it all kinds of stuff, and I wouldn't see the change come through all the time. So I'm not quite sure, but I love VS Code. If I can run it in there, it was nice. But this was very friendly for me, a non-notebook guy. But just kind of like we talked about, you get that SQL instance. So I'll get out of the notebooks here. But if I am in here and you got your SQL data set, I can now go to my SQL endpoint. And again, this is a real endpoint. If I have the right permissions and I've given them to someone, I can literally open up SQL Explorer, SQL Studio on my local machine and connect to it, which is really nice, assuming I had the right permissions. But of course, I've got the whole cloud version of SQL here. So this is just previewing the data. But man, I mean, I can run my queries, 10 star from what is it, sales. You can see I've got code, syntax, help, and all that. I'll run it, and there we go. So I can download it, I can visualize it, I can jump straight from here into a Power BI report. And so that's talking about the lake houses, that's talking about our notebooks. You can create your models. And again, just to kind of wrap this up, it all lives within your workspace. So the workspace, again, is kind of like your product. The domain is like your payroll, your department, however you want to break it down. But the workspace is your product. So within the workspace, I can have my lake houses, I can have my medallion models. The SQL endpoint is kind of default. You probably lock that down. But I can create a new SQL endpoint that only hits certain data sets. So I can have my medallion model for my data sets. I've got my raw, I've got my curated, and then my purpose-built, and then I could give people access to those purpose-built data sets. That's what they would see. If I gave them access per group or per user or just in general, I can now endorse them. I can add comments to them. They would show up when you're searching for new data. You could actually see the lineage on where that's coming through. And that's a high-level overview. They've got all kinds of things as far as data quality. You're looking at Synapse, governance and stuff like that. You can have governance permissions on the workspaces. They're trying to add it a little bit to the domains, but then you can have it on individual items as well. So I can have governance and quality settings for the whole workspace, and then for my gold data sets, I can have a different set of sharing permissions on those. That was a whirlwind tour. Sorry, does that make any sense? Any questions?
It was great. Thank you. It was super useful. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Really, really great. Thank you.